Happy Monday and welcome back to your favorite podcast ever. That's right. Lions of Liberty with Marc Claire. And man, life has just been, it's been wild and crazy. Let's just put it that way. Mostly in a good way, but you know, whenever you're going through changes and getting a lot of things done, a lot of hecticness comes with it. And that is all my way to say this was not the perfectly recorded episode. You'll hear a little echoey. I've been bouncing from Airbnb to Airbnb. I'm actually recording this portion of the podcast in a hotel right now. Due to my terrible internet at this B&B last week when I did the interview you're going to hear with Tho Bishop today, we almost gave up on the interview, but then we decided, Tho had the brilliant idea, let's just turn our video off and get this thing done. And everything went smooth once we turned that video off. So there will be versions of this show posted on YouTube and Odyssey as always, but there won't be actual video. You won't get to see the beautiful faces of Tho Bishop and I. That being said, let's just get right to it. This is a broadcast I did last Monday, right after the Reno Reset with Tho Bishop. And really my only regret is I can't believe it. It might have only happened once or twice before. I forgot to ask Tho if he was ready to roar. My God, but as you'll hear, he was, and he did. So enjoy the show, kids. As you cannot see our video because we gave it a big soldier's attempt, a big college try at doing a video stream, but it is simply not possible with the shitty Mexican Airbnb internet I am currently on. But nonetheless, even though I can't see him anymore, I'm pleased to be speaking to the man himself from the Mises Institute. I totally forgot your title, though. What is your title at the Mises Institute?
Associate editor.
Associate editor at the Mises Institute, as well as I believe it is vice chair of the Bay County GOP. Is that correct?
That is true.
Perfect. All right. Well, before we get into some of the topics that we're going to talk about today, why don't we touch on, I guess, the talk of Liberty Twitter right now, at least this week, at least as of this recording. The Libertarian Party Mises Caucus did, in fact, accomplish quite handily, I guess I have to say, the Reno Reset. They pretty much swept, I think, essentially every single position and essentially do control the Libertarian Party now. Though, just starting off here, what are your thoughts on this? Did you expect this to go down this way? And where do you see this going in terms of how the Mises Caucus is able to affect our political world?
Well, it certainly seemed to be trending that way for a while. And first and foremost, again, in spite of all of my other, strategic issues with the LP strategy, it is great to see bad people lose. And I was surprised by how much joy I got from just reading all of the angry hate posts from all the losers out there. So again, regardless of everything else, strategic differences aside, I think the people that were behind the Reno takeover, Reno Reset, I think the entire Mises Caucus group consists of the best parts of the LP. More power to them. I hope that they are successful in everything that they try to accomplish. And in particular, I'm glad Josh Smith being able to take a hold of the vice chairman position without the official backing of the caucus. As someone, I have a soft spot whenever I see populist the intrinsicy there. So I think that was a very good sign with just some of the stuff going on in there. So again, I'm doubtful skeptical that this is going to have any larger impact on the duopoly or anything else out there in politics. But at least for one good weekend, all the worst people in the libertarian movement were upset, and that there's some value in that, if nothing else.
Yeah, I think I would pretty much echo your thoughts there. As much as I, too, have been critical of even really the concept of bothering to take over America's largest third party, bothering to take over the LP, there is that part of me, too, that just watches the cringiest people that we know anywhere near this movement have absolute meltdowns and absolute breakdowns. And there is absolute entertainment and value in that for me that I certainly will not deny. And something else you mentioned there of Joshua Smith kind of out-populisting the populists. I mean, within the LP, he was not given the endorsement by the Mises Caucus. They did first go with someone else, and I think they kind of backtracked on the endorsement, decided not to endorse anybody. And then Dave Smith strongly came out for Joshua Smith, and he ended up taking that vice chair position. So that is a kind of an interesting little side story as well. I almost forgot about that till I saw this graphic this morning of all of the Mises Caucus members that endorsements that got positions, and there was like 20 people on this thing, and Joshua was nowhere to be found. And then that's when I kind of remembered, oh yeah, he actually didn't technically get the Mises Caucus endorsement. So that's an interesting little side story that we'll keep an eye on there. But where do you see the Mises Caucus affecting? Do you think they can affect national politics in any way, or do you think that, because a lot of the arguments that we'll hear is like, we're doing a lot of stuff locally that will bear fruit. Do you think that maybe even on a maybe piece by piece local level, just like you are working locally in the GOP, is there any chance that working within a Mises Caucus in a certain area might actually bear fruit locally for some of them as well?
What's funny is, and I'm skeptical again of the energy that you saw this weekend kind of continuing forward, but where there could be the potential for genuine value out there is kind of if the LP under the Mises Caucus leadership almost embraces a outflanking the right from the right. And really, when it comes to the issues that I think they've prioritized, right, as such as the COVID regime, obviously gun rights are going to be one of those issues. The going against the FBI and all of these bureaucratic agencies that Tucker Carlson complains about, right? If the LP can be a mechanism by which, instead of the corporate press kind of propping up a libertarian every time that they have a position that confirms the left's bias on a certain issue, if instead you have people pointing out that, hey, look, macho Republican, why aren't you as right-wing as the LP is on this constitutional issue, or this something that kind of gets the blood pumping for ultra MAGA crowd, right? Then I think it could be useful, that. And that doesn't necessarily require it to becoming hardcore conservative on those issues where they want to outflank the left from the left, right? At least theoretically, right? It's all about prioritizing and the communication. I think Angela McArdle is as good as anyone in the LP, and presenting these sort of pushback narratives and everything that she's been doing in California on the COVID regime stuff. So, maybe if they can really commit as an organization to taking it straight to the regime in ways that populist right people could find useful, then that might be able to create a dynamic there where maybe it can kind of help this broader, populist moment where the energy is again firmly in the Tucker Carlson sort of right camp. But we'll see if that continues. But again, it's going to require, I think, again, a lot of party discipline, which libertarians are particularly known for. Will we now see the opportunities where people are going to really, Justin Amash's entire message, which I think had some good stuff in there. I'm not trying to bash Amash broadly, but his entire focus on when he win elections. I think that if that becomes the focus of the post 2022 convention, I think that's going to be lackluster. If instead it can be used to kind of shift the Overton window a little bit more to what would now be, I think, currently be described as the right. I think that could be something potentially useful. We'll see.
Yeah, and certainly, and if this ends up getting me, let's say, Angela McArdle on MSM giving the quote unquote libertarian position on something, or Joshua Smith, if I can get them on the TV saying that kind of stuff instead of, let's say, a Nicholas Sarwark, if that's the result of this, I'll see that as a positive. So I won't deny that there are certainly potential good effects from this stuff. Since you brought it up there, since you brought up Justin Amash, why don't we just look at his speech? I think you did watch the whole thing. I just saw some snippets of it, but he did give a speech at the Libertarian Convention, and he did sort of try to troll the MC a little bit by putting out some Mises quotes that ended up getting booed. Just want to get your take on that speech and what you thought of Justin Amash's kind of angle to attempt to. I don't think he was really trying to troll as much as, well, maybe troll in a way, but as much as just kind of show like, look, my brand of libertarianism here belongs here as much as yours does.
Yeah, and I think this is some of the best Amash stuff I've seen, where he was being a little punchy, I think, by emphasizing certain parts of liberalism by Mises, because you see this a lot, right, where people kind of wave the banners or wear the shirt of a scholar to kind of make them feel more intellectually intelligent, and then you don't understand really some of the ideas they really have about things. And I think there is some value with I've revisiting some of Mises's less doctrinaire modern libertarian stuff. I think there's some interesting lessons there, and I think that he was having fun pushing back on that. He did not emphasize the part of liberalism where Mises talks about how it is completely understandable for native populations under an interventionist government to fear a great replacement if you have open borders. That's one of the more interesting, I think, parts of that book in question. But the problem is that the first half, I think, was fun and good. Then it kind of really kind of lost itself into the celebration of democracy itself. He starts off like this really weird, interesting kind of lack of self-awareness thing where he talks about how, like, oh yeah, when I was a Republican, everyone knew I was a libertarian and I could keep winning elections. And it's like, well, let's think that through again. Neither here nor there. But it's the second stuff where it's the more emphasis on trying to bridge small government fiscal conservatism with, I think, a more liberal aesthetic. Then I think I understand where he's coming from. But it's just something I don't think works, and I think Amash is an example of it not working. There's just not a political constituency for I think for that sort of model, and I think that when we think about what are the actual changes to the system, what surprises things, it's not these, it's not just an Amash, it's not the very selective grouping that a Reason magazine is trying to appeal to. It's something that can resonate a large enough of the population at an emotional level. And of course, with Amash, right? He was highlighting all the times that he voted no on things that were seen as, obvious or popular or whatever, and still was able to win his seat. When he lost was when he went against Donald Trump as a personal figure, with emotion attached to that. And that's where he went from being able to be a far libertarian congressman to being an unelectable congressman. And so that dynamic is something where, again, I think there's lessons to learn from the example of Amash, and something that we should be avoiding. Where he is at politically is the least relevant he's been in 12 years, and like that should be the lesson. That should be the takeaway that we get, I think, from some of this sort of talk, rather than the direction that it goes going back to the broader LP convention thing too, like the framing of this past weekend within Reason, within some of the more public commentators out there from Beltway libertarianism. I think that is such an interesting dynamic in its own right, because these people that have been lecturing for years now the proper way of selling libertarianism, these people couldn't even maintain their own influence within a third party. And I think that right there is a greater condemnation of their entire approach, their entire worldview, than any sick dunk some Hoppian could throw out there on Twitter.
All right. Well, last LP question, just on this track, because I think Amash kind of went all in on the idea of going the LP route, and as we've seen, he went from giving speeches in front of Congress to giving speeches in a convention hall in Reno. So we saw how that worked out for him. But he has kind of gone on. You got to think he still has some interest in becoming the LP nominee. When he first entered the party, it was more of the Bill Weldian sort of Gary Johnson party, and now it is clearly the Mises Caucus party. Do you think he has any chance? I mean, he does have that, I guess, as far as Libertarian Party potential candidates go, he has that resume, so to speak, and he hasn't really been, while he's not the Mises Caucus's guy by any means, he certainly hasn't been, I wouldn't say he's been an enemy of the caucus at all. So do you see him having any chance of becoming the nominee, or is this pretty much Dave Smith's if he wants it now?
Oh, I don't think he could beat Dave if it came down to it. I don't think. I think that his entire approach that he articulated, it would surprise me if that's what the Mises Caucus dominated LP wanted to go with in 2024. To me, I think it's, while Amash is much better, I think in many ways, at least at this point in his career, than Gary Johnson is. Tone wise, I think that there is, I don't think they're antagonistic against each other, but I don't think that they're in the same boat right now. And I think you saw that was some of the more substantive critiques on changes over the platform and things like that. The things that weren't purely personality driven, but instead reflected more substantive changes in the direction and strategy of the organization. But the best thing that could happen to Amash, I think, right now, I know he's teaching, he's doing some teaching stuff, which is great. I'd much rather have him there than most former politicians. But if Cato is going to become something more useful down the line, I think the approach, the style of Amash, which is again very intellectual, but not being a ass, for lack of better words, is a lot better than a lot of the most public figures that Cato has. The Alex Nazaraths, the Aaron Ross Powells, the people that kind of enjoy rubbing people's nose and how elite they are. I'd much rather see Amash kind of take over something and kind of become the face of Cato. I think that would be a good thing for all involved. But I think that's going to be more likely than a presidential run. I think that would be a better direction with where politics is right now. maybe the winds will change, and really what people end up demanding by the masses is some proud Hayekian.
Right. Well, I've got my popcorn out either way. I'll say that I find all this very much entertaining. But moving along, let's move along from the LP to talk about more of what you are doing within the GOP. And there's just a couple sort of, I guess, myths I want to kind of dispel along the way. Why don't we actually just start with Paleolibertarianism? This is a term that gets tossed around a lot, usually in a pejorative manner from, I guess, the cringe kind of libertarians that we were talking about before. What is your take on just what Paleolibertarianism really is, and where you see it fitting in today's political context? Increasingly,
I'm just okay with the simplification of libertarian politics with conservative social theory. Right? It is a culturally thick form of libertarianism. I don't think that it has dramatically changed my view of the state as an institution at all. It's just a recognition that in order to have a decreased role for the state, or no role for the state, it requires common communal values. And that what you end up seeing is that what preserves liberty are those that I think go beyond individualism in the most crass sense, right? It is creating high trust societies, which again goes to common moral values, usually through the church. It comes from recognizing that you yourself are not the most important thing. So, I think that recognizing that in order to be a good neighbor, it means that you can't do simply whatever you want to do. You have responsibilities and duties to others, and so I think that ends up conforming itself to taking the most radical parts of our views of the state, and ultimately, I think this is one of the things that I've come to appreciate over the last few years. And Ryan McMakin did a great lecture on this at Mises U last year, 2021, about historically I think the question of legitimacy in the state is very important. And obviously there's certain sort of anarchists that would say the state can never be legitimate, but ultimately it's if the state is providing services to its people, it is a legitimate entity, and if it's being a parasitic entity, then it's not. And I think ultimately when you realize what allows for governance to be beneficial and not parasitic, I think you often recognize that there really is no separation of church and state, right? There is a value system that is reflected within the use of arms and things like that. And so that itself just requires focusing on the questions of morality and values, and recognizing that you are more aligned with cultural conservatism than you are with either left libertarianism or cultural relativism. And I think it's not that difficult. I think that it's something that I think politically you're seeing it play out in a variety of different ways. The entire shift on the right towards recognizing that the FBI is capable of creating false flag incidents to arrest political dissidents. Right, the weaponization of the banking system. That used to be a conspiracy theorist position only. Right, and now what it's doing is it's shaping the role that law and order conservatives have, their perception of the FBI as a legitimate institution. Right, the entire perception of Washington as having any legitimate ruling. And so I think this is what's creating what I think is a paleo-libertarian populist moment in this country. Whether people use that term or not is irrelevant. Whether people are reading old Murray Rothbard articles or not is irrelevant. It is an emotional feeling of those. And again, it typically is the Christian front. And of course, you can see this, I think, play out most obviously with who are being attacked the most in the press, which again, shout out to the Mises Caucus for the Southern Poverty Law Center attack piece. But along those lines, right, it's like there's been a lot of concerns about Christian nationalism, right, as an insidious threat taking over churches. I think that is a reflection of a paleo libertarian revival, if you will, because within that Christian nationalism is a questioning of the righteousness of federal state. You see it play out with obviously the MAGA crowds and the Marjorie Taylor Greens, the Matt Gaetzes and the like. And so I think all of this, it's ultimately that is the explicitly culturally conservative aspect, which is some of the and I think the Mises Caucus, right, for example, is trying to make an appeal to such people by eliminating explicit mentions of abortion, right? Getting rid of the some of the wokish sort of language on discrimination stuff. Because what those comes down to is just kind of recognizing that we have, that these cultural preferences, even if you disagree with them, are valid. And I think that is something that we're seeing more and more play out in society right now. And I think there's nothing that's changed my opinion over the last year in terms of what direction I find myself leaning towards.
All right, gang. Well, you know what I would be leaning towards if I was, let's say, a young man between the ages of 16 to 24 this summer? That would be the event being put on by our newest sponsors. That is the Reason and Power Summer Seminar. And this event, well, it's not for me. It's not for me because this is for young people. This is for youth age 16 to 24. I am, let's just say, older than that. But my gosh, do I wish somebody had kicked me in the butt and sent me to something like this when I was that age. This is a fantastic seminar bringing young people from all around the U.S. and beyond for deep discussions on foundational philosophical texts. They utilize the powerful Socratic method where students learn through dialogue, not just from lectures. By the end of this event, students are going to discover just amazing connections between the ideas that they read and discuss and the contemporary world that they inhabit. The bridge that I have been trying to help people cross for much of this podcast, how to take this theoretical and apply it to the real world where that's exactly what you're going to learn to do. Well, maybe not you, but maybe a young person around you or a young person that you know. Although I do know we have a good number of young people listening to the show. So if you are between the ages of 16 to 24, or you have a loved one who is, you gotta send them or send yourself to the Reason and Power Summer Seminar. Register by June 15th. You got to do this soon, friends, to take advantage of the early bird discount. For more information, visit thegreatconnections.org/seminars. Again, that is the Reason and Power Summit. Head over to thegreatconnections.org/seminars. One interesting thing you mentioned there is, how a lot of people on the right, the far right, the dissident right, whatever you might want to call it, are losing faith in the FBI as an institution and seeing the FBI as illegitimate. And when you think about this, what have libertarians or anarcho-capitalists been trying to do by beating people over the head with it since their inception? It's convinced them the state is illegitimate, but doing so through handing them human action or what have you, doing so through winning the logical arguments. But here we have something just naturally playing out without necessarily libertarians having to hand everybody anatomy of the state along the way, where you see a huge segment of the culture on the right just coming to distrust the FBI and see it as illegitimate. So you're seeing this effect on the right, not in the same way that a lot of libertarians are trying to get there. But when you see that happening, you have two options. We could tell them, no, you're still statist because you believe in maybe these other parts of government. Or we can say, not I told you so, but show where we have that overlap and kind of show them maybe you can introduce some anatomy of the state articles at that point. Maybe you can show them, well, yeah, this is kind of what we've been trying to say. And maybe you can see our viewpoint that way. So there are ways to, I think what a lot of people seem to mix up here, and this can kind of dovetail into talking about more of what you're doing with the GOP locally, is a lot of people think, oh, you have to go in and then give up your libertarian positions to join the GOP and to work within the GOP, where to me, I see it as quite the opposite and quite the opposite of a superpower. You can walk into a GOP meeting and show them why they're already libertarian in some ways. So can you maybe break that down maybe in terms of how you've been operating within the Bay County GOP? Yeah.
And I think this. I've been going through the French Revolution a lot lately because I find it a fascinating period from a variety of perspectives.
I've seen lots of Napoleon tweets lately.
Yeah, and there's a dynamic here that I've come to just appreciate more and more in terms of understanding the current framework and really the way that democratic frameworks have always existed, and that's that there's always a portion of historically it would be the nobles and the elites, right? They were the ones that would read the philosophy books, and they would discuss them in places like salons, right? The high intellectual ideals, and they since they were within kind of the noble elite class, they had a little bit of influence with typically within the way some of the political intrigue played out and its ramifications for the state, and so that's the way that a lot of societies, even a lot of republics, kind of operated on this. This was kind of. Think about the original political framework of the after the American Revolution, right? You have It's the high-landed gentry that have the political power. And so there's a dynamic there where it really is the intellectual currents that can end up shaping the political discourse. Then you broaden things out and you get to a more democratic system where you have no obvious barriers of entry besides age and citizenship and some of the bare minimums there. What you have is that within current society, politics is sold as a civic responsibility, right? So we place a high emphasis on voter turnout. There's various things that we fund in terms of raising voter turnout. And so what that's going to lead so that has led to a politics where political weapons, political power is kind of wielded by who can turn up the emotion of the masses, the people that aren't engaged in political discussions. And that has been shaped in a bit with the social media, where you now have that class that's not going deep but still can have conversations and things like that. A similar dynamic played out after the French Revolution, where you had you had very idealistic people putting in charge, you're trying to elect their ideas into the General Assembly or the revolutionary government. And at the top, you would have the people that were end up rising. They were either incapable of dealing with political dissidents, which is how you get Robespierre, because he was so believed in his political values that you have to deal with political dissidents one way, or you get them so cynical that they'll do whatever they can to kind of sell out everything else to rise in power. And I think that this is a dynamic where that has been at play, where a lot of the people that want to embrace the very ideological sort of games, they focus on making arguments to the people where they're responding to actual hardships that they're facing rather than intellectual ideas, right? The French Revolution was being fueled by grain riots, right? And then that was added to the unpopularity of the king, and then you have armed attacks from the guard against the public, and all of this kind of created a self-reinforcing mechanism here that, more than the ideas of the Enlightenment, it was the ability to organize and mobilize the masses, the peasantry class, particularly in the Parisian peasants, against the order that led to the toppling of the system, and what led to inevitably chaos until you had kind of a replacement king rise up and Napoleon Bonaparte. That is a dynamic which is kind of long-winded there. The relevance, though, is that within the right, what we've seen is that the person that can kind of bring together a lot of disenfranchised center-right, and by this, I mean center-right is simply, they people that recognize that a man with a beard is not a woman and don't hate the American flag, right?
That's
like that is what it comes down to with how politics have gone. And so, it requires a certain force of personality to kind of bring together responses, material responses that are making people feel like they're being left out beyond the high-minded ideas. And ultimately, I think that's what I find, why I find this moment so interesting, because so like the work that I'm doing with the Bay GOP, it is to try to connect Rothbardian ideas, the ideas that I think most of your audience would agree with me on, and just trying to communicate them in a way to highlight the relevance they have to the material forces that these people that they may never get beyond watching Tucker Carlson or listening to Ben Shapiro.
Right.
A lot of Ben Shapiro fans, within my audience, they're not going to read Human Action or For New Liberty. They're willing to engage to that point, or they might even not go that far. They just know that they hate paying $5 for gas, right? And so that is ultimately what I think politics truly is. It's not these intellectual debates. It's not conversations about theory. Those things can be useful into how power is wielded, but ultimately, what power really becomes, what politics really becomes, is the ability to mobilize and organize power forces within society around a banner that has connected to it with its own ideas. And sometimes those ideas can even be inconsistent and incompatible, right? Like this is not necessarily, again, rationality and comprehension is not really, necessarily what wins in this sort of game. And so, the stuff that we're trying to do is, again, just trying to be the most out front, explicit, cheerleader for Ron DeSantis and still Trump, and particularly doing so and identifying the ways that they are, going after, they're making moves that most Republicans aren't, like highlighting where they are different from a Mitch McConnell or a Marco Rubio at times, or like my Congressman Neil Dunn, who's been very, very bad, and getting a lot of pushback locally for the $40 billion vote against Ukraine, which is sort of issue that would, often kind of go by the wayside, right? Highlighting how the major figures that motivate the masses here locally as Republicans, what makes them better than average. And by doing that, we can kind of get them on board with, I think, a more radical populist agenda. And I think ultimately that's where this battleground going on the right is. This is what matters the most. And it's very interesting to see the sort of bedfellows popping up within the new right. You have Posobiec, retweeting Mises stuff and even talking about the Mises Caucus, right? You've got Jesse Kelly, who's good friends with Dave Smith, right? Like that's where I think there's some very interesting sort of overlaps going on, and just trying to do whatever we can on a local level to bridge that with my neighbors, fellow Republicans in Bay County.
One of the things I hear a lot when people are criticizing you or just anybody doing work within the GOP is they'll say, "Oh, Tho just wants you to go vote GOP," as if that is the summary of your strategy here. I mean, to me, that's as silly as saying the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus just wants you to vote Libertarian. Well, of course they want more than that. That's why they're trying to replace the people and put better people into that party and then vote for them. It would be more their idea. And I think when I see the kind of messaging you're doing out there, the vast majority of your messaging that I've seen anyway is going after other Republicans and other Republicans in your county who you think are really selling out the people. So can you dig into like more of the inner party workings that you're kind of messaging through, trying to influence the party itself to, I don't know if you want to say become more libertarian necessarily, but to become more populist and to be embracing a lot more of the positions that I think most, libertarian leaning people would probably end up being more in favor of than otherwise. Yeah.
Like, my Republican congressman hates me. And for good reason. Like I've been very, very vocal against them. The good thing though, is that like, I think that the message that I like is that we deserve better. Right. And that comes to the whole thing where, if the idea is simply vote GOP no matter who, like, no, like the goal is working within the GOP to piss off all of the uniparty figures, the Dan Crenshaws of the world, the Liz Cheneys, right? Those folks, and to get them out and to create a system that is hostile to them being in there. And so that means highlighting every single time a congressman has a bad vote on guns. If your community is very passionate about guns, that means, I think particularly taking the messaging on like the Ukraine issue, where it's very easy to have, I think, to be conflicted on that issue, right? I think it's very easy to look at what has happened there, to see that Putin's war is an act of aggression. Therefore, seeing rather than a sort of abstract argument for weapons or something else, this is something that if you're not going to have the international order step up for a sovereign nation invading another sovereign nation, what's the point there? And I understand that on a certain level, but then when you do that combined with the billions of dollars going over there, where you have the most severe economic environment that America's had in a very long time, that highlighting and emphasizing that point, like that is, if there's going to be any chance of, I think, turning the conservative voting bloc of America into an anti-regime framework, it very much is that nationalistic America first. Why aren't we taking care of Americans over Ukrainians or Iraqis or anyone else out there? Hopefully that would include throughout Europe and in other parts of the world. That dynamic is something that because it's uniquely nationalist. Like that's the battle. I think one of those areas where there really is that battleground where people. It's not going to be won by high-minded ideas. It's going to become who wins that battle of emotion, that gun instinct battle. And so that's where So I'm hated far more by, I think, local Republican traditional power bosses than I am, by any other aspect of libertarian Twitter. Certainly more so, I think, than most of the people, the Libertarian Mises Caucus. Though it is funny, of late, the local Democrats have now started to attack me as well. So it's very fun when you have the establishment Republicans and the small group of like crazy left-wing activists here locally, being the most negative on you at the same time. That's when you know you're on the right direction right there.
Yeah, I mean, when you've got the right enemies, it says a little something about if you're on the right path or not. I don't want to keep digging on the Mises Caucus thing, but I am just kind of curious, like just because a lot of this criticism does come from people within the Mises Caucus, like how different would your approach have to be? Or, I mean, you probably couldn't even get the foot in the door with the kind of people that you're talking to and that you're working politically with right now if you approach them from not even the Libertarian Party, but just any third party, or maybe even as an independent. So why do you think it's so important to do what you're doing specifically through the GOP, and how would that just be so much more difficult or maybe even impossible if you were taking a Libertarian Party route or maybe even an independent route?
One of the things I've been very excited about is the amount of Republican congressional staffers that have reached out, and we've been able to get together at CPAC or some of these Turning Point USA events and things like that. It's the personal relationships that I've been able to make by truly embracing the right, and particularly Republican politics and all the inner-gritty with inner battles within that. That has allowed me to where I'm not going to I'm not trying to win over the masses on reading Safety Amos's The Bitcoin Standard, right? What I have had success with is being able to talk to a congressional staffer in a certain senator's office. And we were able to actually stop a really bad Federal Reserve nominee from getting on the Fed because a Senate staffer whose boss was in charge of setting the voting schedule made sure that nominee was never confirmed. And it's because of a conversation I was able to have directly with them. And part of that just comes from the benefit of mutual respect and being on the same team. And while I think that there's I don't think that every person that is a capital L libertarian is not taken seriously by some of these groups. I think there is a level there where it never helps, right? A capital L libertarian is never taken more seriously by a Republican because of that party affiliation. And so And so that means at the state level, again, trying to build stronger relationships with staff members of the DeSantis orbit, right? It's trying to build closer relationships with people like Anthony Sabatini or other state members that are more aligned for this. And I can do that with the party, through the party system, where that title, that position helps open up very much so those relationships. And again, as you mentioned, those would be a lot harder to have without, if I was an LP member, if I was an independent, if I was outside of that club. And so, I think where you can really make the intellectual arguments are within those sort of one-on-ones. And that's, I take tremendous value of that. And I'm very optimistic on some of the stuff that we can accomplish in the next few years. Again, Mike Collins, who's a congressman running up in Athens, Georgia, he's going into a runoff. He was the leader in the first round a great deal. I mean, I've been able to sit down multiple times with him, talk about Bitcoin and things like that. Again, he's likely going to be a congressman come November. Those relationships, it's up to me to kind of make them useful. But that's where I find this battleground most effective. It's not the ballot box, right? Yeah, voting is the lowest form of political engagement. It is the persuasion of others. It is the making connections with others. That aspect is what I find far more important and a lot more interesting in the political process.
Right. And then operating within the GOP in the way you do kind of allows you to be, I guess, sort of the Ron Paul of your local area. You can come in and say, no, look, I'm actually the one that's giving what should be the true Republican position. I'm the one that's actually standing up for my community. This is what we need to be doing. Look at these guys. Look at this old guard that's in there. They're no different than the Democrats. So to me, whether or not anybody agrees with that as a good strategy, it's certainly not just go vote GOP, I guess is the point.
Right. Engage the process at the areas where they really matter. And that's I'm trying to do some stuff right now with the school board, without the actual position itself, because again, like it's incredible, sort of opportunities that you have if you just show up. And particularly if you can bring a few friends with you, and like the organizing framework of a political party is one of the best ways of going about that.
All right, gang. Well, you know what I hope you're going to be going about? Like that transition? That is to be checking out the fantastic CBD products from our friends Carlos and Vanessa Abelar at Paloma Verde CBD.com. These guys have, I'm not just saying this because they're sponsors, this is actually true. They do have the best CBD products I have ever used. I tried a various number of CBD products for aches and pains, for insomnia, when I was in Los Angeles at a few different stores. And then when we connected with Carlos and Vanessa, they were kind enough to send me some samples. And this salve they have, my God, I have had this like pain in my shoulder and my neck for years and years. This is one of the few things that has ever truly calmed that down. By the way, they have some amazing gummies, and I'm just going to tell you that my only criticism, I'm whispering, I don't want Carlos to hear me because I do have a criticism. They're so delicious. You just want to eat them all in one batch. So you might want to order two things of the gummies. But what's great about this is that because they are sponsors, because they support us, we support them, we support you, you're going to get a 20% discount off any order, as well as free shipping for any order over $75 by using discount code ROAR at checkout. So head over to PalomaVerdeCBD.com and use discount code ROAR for 20% off that order. One thing I want to talk to you about a little bit more too. Well, actually, first, I'll save the Florida stuff for a minute. First, I want to go back because my knowledge of Napoleon is probably fairly surface level. It's probably just whatever I got in high school and then, whatever I got from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. That's pretty much my Napoleon knowledge. So maybe you could dig in a little more onto what you've been learning about Napoleon and how we can apply some of those lessons to perhaps our current political situation.
Sure. Well, again, this has been a lot of fun because I think it's very easy to retreat into history and into our, some really intelligent theoretical thinkers, and it's easy to kind of just enjoy them for themselves and to try whereas I think to make them really useful, you have to find ways of taking these sort of historical lessons, these great thinkers, and applying it to modern day politics. And so I've been really interested since I've gone down my sort of hardcore populist rabbit hole with the idea of the great men of history that end up really resetting orders. And, I think Andrew Jackson is a great man of American history. I think Abraham Lincoln is a great man of American history, perhaps with a lesser approved outcomes and some of the structures of government in that ways. But but as most Americans, my knowledge of European history was lacking. Everyone had, I think a lot of people, if you're going down this rabbit hole, you eventually get to your Roman fetish. And so I've had a lot of time dealing with the Romans, but Napoleon was someone who increasingly stood out to me because, going down, sort of the neo-reactionary rabbit hole or the anti-Enlightenment stuff. Those are, and I loved your episode with R.N. McIntyre recently. And what's interesting is Napoleon sits within this very interesting period where he is simultaneously both a direct product of the Enlightenment and this revolutionary left-wing sort of framework that we're supposed to see as the current enemy, and yet he himself was also a counter-revolutionary figure that. If the goal, right, is to transform a republic back to a monarchy, well, Napoleon is someone who actually did that, right? Like he was someone who was so talented as a military general, that his victories made him extremely popular. He shared the bag, with the French people, with his conquers, with his victories in Italy. Brought back all this sort of great scientific advancements and artistic sort of stuff to the great museums of France when he had his expedition in Egypt, which he kind of bailed out when it was about to get really, really bad. But it made him a very, very popular figure. And because of his popularity, he was able to essentially end a period of political bloodshed and chaos. Like the revolution gave you, you had originally kind of the moderates in charge, the Lafayettes, and kind of the American liberals, and then they were overthrown, and you have the Reign on Terror with the Jacobins, And then Robespierre comes in charge, and then Robespierre is overthrown by people just as guilty in the great terror as he is, but far more corrupt and therefore self-serving. And so it's just this period of chaos. And what I find interesting about this is that if you look at what allowed for this was the Enlightenment's embrace of meritocracy and disavowalment of pure natural hierarchy. That was the only system that in the first place allowed a Napoleon to step up. And so I think there's something to be said about what the Enlightenment did in improving meritocracy and giving upstarts. And I think he saw similar sort of stuff within America. Alexander Hamilton, I think, is very much a Bonapartian sort of figure. Like Bonaparte. In fact, I think they have a lot of very similar views. Their economic views are very inspired by Colbert, who was the finance minister of King Louis, which was this very bad mercantilist idea, which actually ends up taking down France. I think that the failing of both Hamilton and Napoleon were bad economic views. Right, and I think that's what separates them from Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson had good economists around him. Napoleon and Hamilton didn't. But there is something to be said there where there is a value within the Enlightenment of allowing people of talent to rise up. There is a dynamic to where Napoleonic France was far better administered when you had that consolidation of power, which I think goes to some of the interesting neo-reactionary arguments for order and things like that, which I think are interesting. And so again, I think in terms of a kind of a historical playground, when you see someone this talented, I mean, like when Napoleon was on the field of battle against another land army, like he was worth like 40,000 men. Like he was like an overpowered video game character, like going around marching around Europe, completely disrupts things. There's something there, again, and able to both overthrow a revolutionary order that was self-destructive by a lot of left-wing impulses, and being reassets. And then, of course, then you have the fall of Napoleon. And the fall of Napoleon came from bad economic policy. It came from imperialism. It came from a lot of these sins that the right can also be kind of seen as having, right? A very jingoistic military policy. Like that's very much kind of what Napoleon had. This protectionist, France first style sort of economic policies, right? Like that ended up being his downfall. And so I think I find myself interested, for one, the lessons to be learned individually just from going down the histories of these great men, and both their failings and their virtues. I think that's just a fun challenge within a variety of different figures. But the second side of it is just the appreciation for where true political gains are made. I think it's what we need, right? If we're looking for solutions to the inadequacies of our current international order. And ultimately, I think that's what this all is about, right? This is not all about playing the role of the critic. This is not all about having an ideological agenda that we talk about on social media. Ultimately, we're trying to identify what does it actually look like to get America not being controlled by lizard people. And ultimately, I don't think that comes about by intellectual discussions at a libertarian convention. I don't think this comes about from opinion pieces in the National Review. I think ultimately what it requires is someone of talent that can amass the popularity of the people enough to use his popularity to overthrow presidents, to overthrow the law at times, to overthrow the current structures that maintain the state, and then have that person, once he achieves that, so that is Napoleon and his coup overthrowing the Directory, and he becomes first consul, and that's the first time Napoleon takes political power. Like that itself, we need to find that moment as well for us, that original victory for a great man of history. Then it is the creation of an order that can actually deliver on the proposed greatness. Napoleon was able to achieve that immediately by winning great military victories, even though his performance actually wasn't that great, neither here nor there. But he was able to end the war that was causing a great amount of stress within France, right? So he was immediately able to bring peace like he promised. They ended up resetting laws. They ended up just kind of, again, not fully embracing everything in the Napoleonic Code and all that sort of stuff, but they were able to maintain order. And in French, the actual quality of life for your average Frenchman went up. And then he was so the question is then, how do you maintain that? Trump actually was very similar. He was able to he overcame Hillary. He won. There were aspects of his 4 years where the material well-being of Americans went up. Obviously underdone. It was plagued by bad, untrustworthy figures within his administration. And Napoleon actually kind of had his own issue. Like he kept putting like his brothers, and he made them like kings of like Spain and all these other territories. And then
it's kind of a Trumpian quality too,
right? And so the question then is, what does it look like to have a great man create an order that can actually elevate greatness and maintain itself? And then it's, how do you maintain it afterwards? And so that's what I find very interesting, is going through the highs and the lows of Napoleonic France. And again, the result of Napoleon's wars were, millions of Europeans slaughtered. I mean, it was very, very bloody. Like there's aspects of it that, he's a very controversial figure because he's critiqued both by conservatives that don't like him because he antagonized the Catholic Church, though he himself brought back the Catholic Church. It's a very, he kind of brought back the Catholic Church and then got excommunicated by the Pope. Very interesting battleground there. So he's condemned by conservatives from some of that stuff. He was condemned by Marx because they saw this as the ultimate failure of, this was their grand revolution of the people being overthrown by a military dictator, right? So Bonapartism becomes a slur within Marxism. He's also praised by an element of the left because he was able to kind of cement the advances, the left-wing advances of the revolution relative to the ancient regime. So for some, they see him as a pragmatic defender of the revolution, and that the revolution would have been forgotten without a Napoleonic figure to kind of keep it up. And then again, I find myself with my own level of appreciation. And again, I'm just very interested. I don't see a lot of neo-reactionary content on Bonaparte himself, because again, like this model is to me very much kind of what we're talking about, right? Or what they're talking about if your goal is to kind of install a king. And so that's why I find, I think there's some very interesting parallels to modern history. I think that there are some good lessons that are true beyond just simply this moment. And I find myself having a lot of fun kind of diving into some of this stuff.
All right, well, I think that this is a good place to sort of segue into talking a little bit more as we wrap up here about who you might view as a potential sort of a Napoleonic figure, at least as far as the free state of Florida goes, and that is Ron DeSantis. And you and I did an interview. I feel like I think it was like last April, before my wife and I even had paid a visit to Florida, let alone made some of the plans that we're orienting towards right now. But maybe you can recap a few of the moves that Ron DeSantis has made, and if you like, maybe sort of tie them into this sort of great man theory and maybe some of the qualities that Napoleon had. But I think when we first spoke last year, vaccines were out, but there weren't really vaccine mandates yet. And of course, for me, I think the biggest, most important moves that Ron DeSantis has made, if you do value bodily autonomy, and maybe you even value that more than the proper libertarian position at all times. I'm doing air quotes since we don't have video here. I'll let you guys know that. But how do you see some of these moves that Ron DeSantis has made, whether it's coming to banning vaccine passports, disallowing businesses from requiring vaccines, or maybe some of the moves that get much bigger headlines, like when it comes to Disney?
Yeah, spoiler alert, I do think DeSantis can be that sort of great man figure. And I'll hold that view until he proves otherwise. And it's been very interesting to see within this last year, since last time we talked, like he's the reason why I have to consider this, because he continues to overperform any reasonable expectation that I could have ever had for the man, even as optimistic as I was last April. And it's precisely that dynamic of, not only has he made, because it's very easy, when you have a Democratic president in particular, to take on the role of kind of 10th Amendment saber rattler, right? Rick Perry was playing this role in 2009, 2010 with, kind of the peak Tea Party years with Obama, right? He'd talk about how, Texas can secede, which was, very bold messaging, but, it was just that. It was bold messaging. There was no actual steps made to nullify federal laws in Texas. There was no great escalation on that front. Mark Sanford, when he was governor of South Carolina, he did some similar stuff. I think he believed it a little bit more. He just ultimately preferred the Appalachian Trail over his duties as governor, which,
fair enough.
Subjective value, And
trips to South America, maybe, we can't judge here.
Yeah. You had state legislators trying to do some of this sort of stuff on a more substantive level, many of which were kind of tied into like the Tom Woods Mises Institute orbit. So that was good to see. Some were successful, most weren't. So it's easy to kind of take on the mantle of big governor taking on DC. The difference is DeSantis is willing to go to be just as strong against corporate power. I had a conversation earlier this year with actually Curtis Yarvin, and I was kind of making my King DeSantis presentation, and he asked me to compare him to like Huey Long. And at the time I said, look, I think they have different values that would probably prevent DeSantis from doing certain things. I don't think DeSantis would bring in a bunch of government officials and have them confess their crimes with his own armed guard in the room, kind of threatening them, and play it for the crowd to see over the radio. That's a power move right there. I don't think that's quite DeSantis' style. And I think that because of that, Huey Long is probably more successful in some ways than perhaps DeSantis would allow himself to. But what we've seen is that much like Huey Long, whose big kind of punching bag was Standard Oil, DeSantis kind of created that with Disney. And what I find fascinating is I know all the libertarian arguments to and from, and ultimately what I enjoy about this is that it's a recognition that policy, that legislation is not always an ends in itself. Sometimes legislation is to send a message. And what the particular policy against Disney from the Florida government, it truly is, and they can never say this, but ultimately it's DeSantis sitting down with the executive of Disney with a grenade and pulling the pin and keeping the hammer pulled down so it doesn't go off, but says, look, if we're going to negotiate, you're going to take me seriously. And now what you have is the Florida government with a, armed grenade at the heart of Walt Disney, sitting there through next session. The specifics of the bill that was passed don't go through until after session. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all if you end up seeing like some sort of reforms on, again, and for those listeners that might have forgotten, since it was many news cycles ago, right? This was the Florida legislature voting to eliminate the special taxing district that Disney has set up within Orlando that gives it basically carte blanche to do whatever it wants on rules and regulations and that sort of stuff within protections that it has from state and county officials. And so because of that, you're already seeing Disney change some of its practices. You have seen other corporations, Netflix, for example, is saying basically, look, if you get offended by some of our content, leave. You had corporate boardrooms saying, we don't want to be the next Disney. There's an unfortunate aspect of this where it highlights the degree to which a lot of large corporations are directly subsidized by political policy. Right. And this highlights the degree to which they are recognizing that if they are located in Texas, and if Texas ends up, finding the balls to be Ron DeSantis and do this sort of stuff, they could be hurt a great deal, right? You because of that use of political power, he has these large corporations that are not market, their cultural viewpoints are not, I think the byproduct of what market demands. That is something that's very, very powerful. Something else that he's done recently that is completely ignored if you're less in Florida is that he actually vetoed a bill that the largest utility provider, Florida Power and Electric here has, and they had, they literally like ran like ghost Senate candidates in third party drawaways. Again, they used every little tool they could to stack the state Senate with enough Republicans to make sure this bill got through. and then DeSantis just vetoes it. It has support over like basically all the Republicans in Tallahassee, the majority of Democrats, and he just vetoes it. And because, again, he recognized that this was a corporate carve-out for a power company that's already deeply unpopular, particularly my neck of the woods, because they're overcharging relative to this other power company they just bought out. Like, he's recognizing that in order to stand up for the middle class, like there is like the actual workers of Florida, like it's not simply the state, like there is corporate power that is being abusive here. Corporate power that is protected by state policy. And that aspect of it, I think, it's something that he still gets great critiques from Republicans, conservative magazines, and things like that for doing this sort of approach. This is him being edgy in policy, not just in rhetoric. And I love that. And like this is the dynamic that makes me further and further sort of convince myself that maybe this guy really does get all the aspects of this game in a way that he really could be a genuine threat to the regime in a way that a Trump couldn't and that no one else in the world stage has. And I think generally, as a strategy, again, going back to some of that conversation about legitimate government versus illegitimate government, ultimately, I think what we've done is he has created a model where we should be wanting every single Republican-controlled, Democrat-controlled state. Every state should have a king, because only a king in that governor's mansion has the power to fight the federal government, I think, in a way that it necessarily needs to do when it oversteps. And I think there can be instances on the left, I think it can be on the right, but a strong executive framework is something that I think is there's value here beyond my own personal attachment to DeSantis as a Florida man, and just simply DeSantis himself as an individual. This is a model, I think, for governing that has a lot of very interesting possibilities down the road.
Do you think Ron DeSantis, I mean, obviously you can't get into anybody else's head, but do you think Ron DeSantis sees himself this way to some extent as well? Because really, if you look at this from anything other than a big picture, he really wants to change certain things way, it's really hard to even understand why he does some of the things he does, because, going against your entire party in the state of, in the state of Florida, for example, going against the entire legislature on something they'd worked for, and machinated their way to make happen, just for him to completely veto it. I mean, that's either really big picture or really principled in his own way, or there's maybe some motivation that I don't even see. But I'm just kind of curious how you view what he's been doing and why he's been taking this approach, even completely going against his own party.
Talking to people around him, and I think he recognizes the moment. I think that 2020 showed DeSantis how different he was. Like, I mean, again, like he went up, even though he wasn't the first, right? Kemp was the first governor to open the state, and obviously Kristi Noem, never locked down, benefits being South Dakota. Like, I think that the steps that he made in 2020, 2021. I think that he recognizes the moment for what it is. And I think he recognizes his place within this moment. And I can tell, talking to people immediately around him, and again, he has had an incredible knack for hiring badasses in positions around him. Again, Christina Pushaw as press secretary is, I mean, like, you couldn't ask for, I mean, anyone out there wanting Michael Malice to run the LP Twitter account, like, I mean, Christina Pushaw has basically been, Malice-like on Maine in the role as press secretary, and like the entire like grooming framework on attacking the left was purely the byproduct of Christina Pushaw on Twitter. Like that, that's being able to identify that sort of talent, give her the flexibility and the freedom for her to be her. Those are the little things that matter to me. It is Joseph Ladapo, the Surgeon General, who was out there protesting with the STDs are demons lady, which again, I'm far more open up to now than I was in 2020, but with the frontline medical workers. That sort of association would have killed him with most Republican governors. Like, he elevated him. And his Secretary of Education that is like, you look up and down the executive positions and the nominations they have are great, and you can always see it because like they get the most hand-wringing possible from our horrible Florida media. Like the new Secretary of State for Florida, I think his wife was out there at January 6th, which I'm sold. If I knew nothing else about the guy, like if that's your wife, I'm sold. And so he's got a knack for surrounding himself with the sort of lieutenants that you need to kind of keep order as well. And I think that I really do think that he understands that he is the leader of the resistance at this point. And I think that is why the biggest thing that scares me is his relationship with Trump. And I think that DeSantis is smart enough to recognize how important that thing is. He has avoided doing anything. He went along with the election stuff rather than dismissing it. After November in 2020, he has publicly played everything smart with Trump as possible. I think that you're going to continue to see some of these bumpings of heads. The more popular DeSantis gets, he's the only person that threatens Trump's hold of the party. That is a very dangerous situation to be, between Trump and popularity. And so that's a dynamic there that I'm still, I'm interested to see play out. And what does that mean for 2024 is it's a whole nother can of worms. But I think he does recognize, I think he has the self-awareness that you need in order to kind of continue on with that. And again, I'm very excited to see where this thing's progressed, because again, he's exceeded every time that I said, okay, well, I don't think he'll be able to do this, if he can, he's having better than I thought. Like, that's come up like 3 or 4 different times now, and he continues to get it. Like the Republican he single-handedly was able to force the legislature to do a congressional map that gave us that gave Republicans the biggest advantage possible, which wiped out all the gains Democrats had made up to this point within the redistricting process. Like, that was only through his own backbone and a legal staff that was willing to fight these battles. Like, he's making differences at the national level, the local level, corporate level, like every single aspect. The biggest issue we have in Florida is that housing prices are insane. And it's all because we have all these people that want to live under the rulership of King DeSantis. And so that's the biggest problem, and it's a serious problem. Like, I'm willing to, that's a whole other conversation.
As someone who's been looking since we last talked, basically, I can say that is absolutely true. And there are parts of me that wish I just pulled a trigger on something a year ago, because I could just, even if I didn't move there, I could cash out right today.
Yeah, like that's the biggest problem facing his citizens. So we'll see how he delivers on that one too.
All right. Well, time will tell, though. And as we wrap up here, why don't you just let everybody know not just how they can follow your work and reach out to you, but I believe, as far as I know, you still do have the standing offer for anybody passing through Bay County, and I still intend to take you up on that when we can make times work. But why don't you just lay that all out for everybody?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're ever down here in the Redneck Riviera and our schedules work, definitely would love to buy you a beer. You can just reach out to me on Twitter at.
Now, is there a 1 beer limit there, or is you got to buy your second one if you want to hang out longer? Depends how the conversation goes.
It depends on the conversation. Yeah, so that's the subjective.
Let's leave that one open ended. Yeah.
But yeah, so that's, you can find me on Twitter. And also, if we've got a great new animated video series about money, if you have any friends, family members, civic groups that, that they're now recognizing that inflation is kind of a big deal and they want to know more about it, what has government done to our money.com? It's going to be a 9-part animated video series. We got the first 4 up there now. There will be more to come very, very soon. So that's what has government done to our money.com, like the Rothbard book. That's one of our newest projects that we have up there now.
All righty. Tho Bishop, thanks so much for coming on. Keep up the great work, buddy. Keep on roaring. We'll talk soon.
Thank you, Marc.
All right, gang. Hope you enjoyed my conversation with Tho Bishop. And just to really drive home how dedicated I am to this podcast, I am currently recording this little outro in a hotel bathroom. That's right. Well, I don't want to hear anybody claim I don't care or I don't make sacrifices for my people to bring you these great conversations every single Monday. Do check out the work that Tho Bishop is doing over at the Mises Institute. Check out what my fellow Lions are doing. Brian with Mean Age Daydream on Wednesdays. Odie with Finding Freedom every single Thursday. You can get them all on the Lions of Liberty Network. You can also subscribe to those feeds individually. You can subscribe to this show individually at the Lions of Liberty with Marc Clair feed. Regardless, I would really appreciate 5-star ratings and great reviews on that Lions of Liberty with Marc Clair feed over at Apple Podcasts. That's a big help to me. You can also follow my writing, marcclair.substack.com. The Watcher Speaks. Speaking of The Watcher Speaking, I spoke with No Way Jose last week. If you want to go check out that discussion, we talked about the Reno Reset more of my thoughts, a little bit of both of our criticisms of the Mises Caucus strategy. Check that out over at No Way Jose. That's all I've got for this week, kids. Until next time.
Live long and live free and live free and live free and live free.